Welcome to my presentation on binocular astronomy on a budget in 2023. This presentation is based on a similar talk I gave at the Western Sydney Amateur Astronomy Group in July of 2012. At the time of this recording, I'm planning to present this talk at the July 2023 WASAG meeting, as well as put a version up on YouTube and make these slides available as a PDF online. The aim is to provide enough information for beginners to be able to confidently buy and use binoculars without falling into any of the traps that would make the experience unpleasant, such as buying an unusable junk pair of binoculars, becoming frustrated with the use of your new binoculars, or damaging them by misusing them or storing them incorrectly. I'll also speak about what to do if you have a pair of binoculars that's not properly aligned, but that is not economical to have professionally repaired. I'm assuming as little knowledge as possible, but hoping that there's enough breadth here that even experienced astronomers should find something useful. We have some very knowledgeable people in the club, so that won't be an easy task. Broadly speaking, I'll be covering three topics. Buying binoculars, why you would buy budget binoculars, what I mean by budget and what compromises that entails. What specifications and features you should pay attention to when buying your binoculars and what all the technical jargon means. And how to test binoculars at the shop if you're given the opportunity. Next, I'll speak about using your binoculars, resources for finding interesting objects to look at with your binoculars, planning with simulated planetarium views and sky charts, and tips for enjoying your binoculars. Lastly, I'll be looking at how to maintain your binoculars. I'll spend a little bit of time on basic care and cleaning, and then move to the more advanced topic of how to align the barrels if you're getting double images, which means they're not collimated. This is also known as dirty collimating. At the end of the slides, you'll find many more references, books, websites, and links to reviews that you will be able to use if you're interested in looking at any of these topics in more depth. I've also included some slides at the end from my 2012 talk that I won't cover in depth and I won't go through tonight. The reason being that they're not as relevant today. The binoculars that I had reviewed are no longer available to purchase new in 2023. So first, some disclaimers. This presentation includes a lot of my own opinions, which some of you may disagree with. Other people will tell you to buy the best binoculars you can afford. We have some amazing expertise in this club, and you should consider other opinions as well. The one thing that I do ask is if you spot any factual errors in my presentation, and there are bound to be some, please do tell me about them so that I can improve it. You should also know that I don't own expensive binoculars to compare the budget binoculars I'm talking about to, and that my eyesight isn't fantastic. I'm still legal to drive as of this year, but I might not see as big a difference as somebody with better eyesight between a very expensive pair of binoculars and a more budget pair. My stigmatism means I'm probably using my averted vision a little bit more than other people might. And while I do speak about what to do when wearing glasses, I find that doesn't work for me, so this is secondhand information. The focus of tonight's talk is going to be using the binoculars for astronomy. Terrestrial viewing has slightly different requirements, and while you can certainly use an astronomical pair of binoculars for terrestrial viewing, I'm not going to focus on those terrestrial aspects at all. I'm just going to mention them in passing. You should also know that the simulated views on these slides are for illustration and they're not exact or perfect. The planetarium software that I'm using, Stellarium, overlays deep sky images. It's not realistic to expect that you'll see as much color and as much detail as in some of the images. I've tried to edit them as best as I can to show what you'll actually see in some cases, and in other cases I've left them as is in order to emphasize what I'm speaking about. Now, if you're going to take one thing away from this talk, and just one thing, it will be that you should never, ever look at the sun with binoculars, not even for the briefest of moments. It takes way less than a second to completely damage your eyesight permanently. So please do not do it. It's the one thing you can do with a pair of binoculars that would have lifelong consequences. Buying binoculars. So why buy budget binoculars and not a telescope? They're easier to use, significantly cheaper, and give you wide views that are excellent when you're becoming familiar with the night sky. They won't let you see small or faint objects like a telescope but they will give you natural 3D stereoscopic views with both your eyes. And for larger objects, they will allow you to see either an entire object or more of the object, or see that object in the context of its surroundings. They're lightweight and compact and take very little time to set up, making them much less of a burden if you're going on holiday or to pull out after a long day at work. And if you're not using them for astronomy, they do have other uses, from bird watching to plane and ship spotting to sports and concerts. There might be better suited binoculars to those tasks, but a pair you bought for astronomy will certainly work. And why budget? Well, for this talk, when I'm talking about budget, I'm talking about under about $130, up from about $100 in 2012. It's still possible to get cheaper pairs though. There are lots of reasons to stick with less expensive pairs of binoculars. For a start, it's 2023 and money's tight. That doesn't need any explanation. But if they're a cheaper pair, you won't be as worried about getting them lost or stolen or damaged, and you may be more likely to take them out with you. You might also be able to afford more than one pair as a backup or for different qualities of different binoculars, or so that the family can use them while you're using yours. And if they do break, you'll be happier to tear them apart and show the kids how they work, which you wouldn't do with an expensive pair. And you'll also have more options if you're buying for a friend or for family as a gift. So will any cheap pair do from Amazon or eBay? Absolutely not. There's a lot of junk out there that's unusable or will easily break and give you horrible views, particularly for astronomy that requires bright, clear, color accurate views. You shouldn't expect to get a pair for under $100 that's as good as, say, a $1,000 pair, but with a bit of experience you can pick up a good usable pair that will last. And there are expensive binoculars that are flawed. I like to say at most you get what you pay for, rather than you always get what you pay for. So what compromises are you going to make by buying an inexpensive pair? Well, quality more expensive binoculars may give you slightly sharper views, a little bit better contrast, a little bit better detail. They may lose less light. The colour might be truer, so there might be less chromatic aberration, meaning colour fringing or colour casts. They might hold their focus and collimation a little bit better and flex less. There's less sample variation, so different copies are likely to all be good. Some have features like not fogging up internally because they're nitrogen filled or waterproof. And some even have advanced features like image stabilization. In general, they're going to be slightly better built, sturdier, and they might last longer, but you will be paying a lot more. So let's look at some of the specifications that you need to pay attention to when you're buying a pair of binoculars. We'll take a look at the prism type, magnification, the kinds of coatings used, field or angle of view, true versus apparent, size of the exit pupil, kinds of glass used in binoculars, eye relief, and other features that you may want to pay some attention to. There are two broad categories of prisms used in binoculars: poro prisms and roof prisms. You'll be able to tell that a pair of binoculars are using poro prisms by looking at the alignment of the eyepiece versus the front objective lens. If they're lined up, the binoculars are using roof prisms. Using poro prisms in the design instead means that the eyepiece and the objective are not lined up, and the binoculars have a distinctive M shape when viewed from above. That makes them shorter but wider. Poro prisms are generally cheaper to manufacture for medium to large binoculars and can give brighter views that are more suited to astronomy. You'll find a larger selection of binoculars with poro prisms, but good pairs can be found in either design. Often you'll see two key specifications listed for a pair of binoculars, two numbers with a multiplication sign in between. For example, 7x50 or 10x50. These are often printed on the binoculars in large print and can be found in the title of some product listings when the binoculars are sold. The first number is how much the binoculars magnify, and the second number is how large the front lenses are in millimeters. So 7x50 means the binoculars magnify 7 times and have 50mm objective lenses. The magnification is especially important if you're hand-holding the binoculars. It's difficult for most people to steadily hand-hold any pair of binoculars that magnifies more than about 10 times. 7 times is usually quoted as ideal, since you'll start to lose details to the wobble. You can put binoculars with larger magnification on a mount, but that adds to the expense, and that's not what we're talking about so much today. The size of the objective lens affects how much light the binoculars gather. If you double this number, you're gathering 4 times the light, because it's the surface area that counts, much like the mirror of a telescope. A lot of binoculars suitable for astronomy have 50mm objective lenses, as that's considered a good balance between them being large enough to collect enough light, but light enough to handhold. They also get expensive as you get much bigger than 50mm. 70mm is probably as much as you would want to handhold. Coatings are important. Without coatings on the lenses and prism, you get internal reflections that cause light loss, ghosting, and other problems. The specifications will generally describe binoculars as featuring glass that has one of 4 levels of coating. Coated means that there is an optical surface somewhere in the binoculars that has received a coating. Multi-coated means something has received more than 1 coating. Fully coated means every surface that matters has been coated at least once, and fully multi-coated means that every surface that matters has been coated with multiple coatings. The spec is often abbreviated as MC, FC, or FMC. As you might guess, this isn't very specific because it doesn't tell you anything about the quality or nature of the coatings themselves. The spec gets abused quite a bit, but in general, fully multi-coated is the most desirable. Looking at the colours of the coating of the front lenses will tell you what colours of the spectrum that coating is blocking. Very reflective ruby, red or orange coatings tend to be the worst. They do increase the contrast, but they also block the light that you're trying to look at. Lighter coatings that are clear are best in my experience. Light blue or purple can be good too, with green being a little bit worse. Next we have field and angle of view. The angle of view tells you how much of an object you'll see through the binoculars at a given distance at any one time. It's also sometimes confusingly called the true field of view. Usually it's quoted as a width at a distance, meters at 1 kilometer, or feet at 1,000 feet are common, but sometimes it's also given as an angle in degrees. The apparent field of view tells you how wide the image looks to your eyes, how much of your vision it fills. A narrow apparent field of view is like looking down a tunnel, whereas your eyes won't see all the edges of the image circle at the same time if your apparent field of view is wide. Getting that wide view requires you to put your eyes close to the eyepiece, which can be a challenge for those of us who wear glasses while viewing. The true field of view depends on the apparent field of view and the magnification. These next slides are simulated views through a couple of different pairs of binoculars to highlight some of the differences the specifications make. These images are taken from free planetarium software called Stellarium. To help show the differences, I've left them brighter and more colourful than what you'd actually expect to see in a pair of binoculars. In this first image, we have a view of the Orion Nebula in 7x50 binoculars, so a magnification of 7 times and 50mm diameter objective lenses. We'll take this as our baseline. And here we've swapped to 15x70 binoculars. So we've gone from a magnification of 7 to a magnification of 15 times. The nebula is obviously bigger, but of course that means we also see a smaller portion of the sky. The angle of view has decreased. The circle itself is the same size, the apparent field of view is the same. The increased magnification would normally mean the image is less bright, but we've also switched to larger 70mm objective lenses, so we're collecting almost twice as much light. In general, as you go to higher magnification, you'll want bigger binoculars. And for comparison, this might be how much of the nebula you manage to see in a telescope at 80 times magnification. Again, the image is a lot brighter and more colourful than you'd actually see in the eyepiece. So to give you an idea of how much brighter, I've just included this slide where I've tried to simulate by desaturating the image and dimming it down what you might actually see with your eyes. And here's what you'd see in 15 by 70 binoculars. Next, let's talk about exit pupil. The exit pupil is how large the circle of light coming out of the eyepiece to hit your eye's pupil is. It is measured in millimeters. If that circle of light is larger than the size to which your pupil can dilate, the light that isn't hitting your pupils is wasted and the view is dimmer than it could be. Pupils dilate less as we age, around 7 millimeters in our teens, down to about 5 millimeters in our 60s. For those interested, I've linked a paper at the end of the slides. The size of the exit pupil is related to magnification, with more magnification leading to a smaller circle. For young observers, 10 times magnification might be dimmer and less detailed than 7 times, but for an older observer whose eyes can't take advantage of the larger exit pupil, the 7 times and 10 times binoculars might appear to be similar. This picture shows the exit pupil on an 8 by 30 pair of binoculars with a field of view of 7.5 degrees. Broadly speaking, there are 2 types of glass commonly used to make prisms for binoculars, BAC 4 and BK7. BAC 4, or barium crown glass, is more desirable. It produces a round exit pupil, has a higher refractive index so that it can bend the light more, and transmits more of the light. The one downside is increased color fringing. BK7 glass is borosilicate flint. Using this kind of glass results in a diamond-shaped exit pupil and has more light loss. Most cheaper binoculars use BK7 glass, and some binoculars listed as having BAC 4 glass actually use a different glass that is not a true barium crown. So at this price point, it's not something you should worry too much about, so long as the image quality is reasonable. On this 7 by 50 pair of binoculars, you can clearly see the edges of a square exit pupil, which tells you these are using BK7 prisms. And here's a close-up. Looking from slightly off-center to the eyepiece while pointing at a bright uniform source of light like the sky, it's usually easy to see the shading that gives away the use of BK7 glass. How far from your eyes you can hold the binoculars and still see the whole image is called the eye relief. Long eye relief binoculars are more suited to eyeglass wearers, as your eyes can sit further back from the eyepiece, allowing room for the glasses. But they'll have less of a wide-angle view. So if you don't need the eye relief, you may prefer binoculars that give you that more immersive wide angle that some people describe as feeling like you're floating among the stars. This is an important consideration if you need to use the binoculars with glasses though. It can make the difference between the pair being unusable and frustrating to use. You want at least 16mm of eye relief for glasses, and you may need more. Long eye relief binoculars can be harder to find since wide angles are often preferred. This slide is a little oversimplified, but shows the trade-off between wide-angle binoculars and long eye relief binoculars. Wide-angle binoculars fill your vision and give you the feeling of being in the scene, but to do that they require your eyes to be closer to the eyepiece. Long eye relief binoculars allow your eyes to be further away from the eyepiece, which is necessary if you use your binoculars with eyeglasses. But the trade-off is that it's like you're looking into a tunnel. Both features are used as selling points when marketing binoculars, depending on the design. There are some other features you want to be aware of. Most binoculars come with a neck strap or wrist strap and some kind of basic cleaning cloth, both of which are useful if you're on a tight budget, but can often be replaced with something better. One very desirable feature that not all binoculars have is a tripod mounting screw. That will let you set the binoculars up for other people to view a particular object and can be less fatiguing for long sessions. Other exotic features like waterproofing and filling the binoculars with nitrogen to avoid condensation are often expensive and not really necessary. Zoom mechanisms break, and the general advice is that they should be avoided. Image stabilization is great but expensive. Built-in cameras are also expensive and usually a gimmick, you're better off with a dedicated camera. And binoculars that boast night vision aren't suited to astronomy. There are some red flags to be aware of that you should never see as a reasonable compromise. I've already mentioned zoom mechanisms. I've never seen a good review of zoom binoculars, and they break very easily. Any binocular advertised as no focus or focus free is only going to be in perfect focus at one distance, and that probably won't be infinity. They also won't allow you to adjust for differences between your eyes. So they won't be suitable for astronomy at all, and they will be a compromise for everything else. You should avoid binoculars with very reflective mirror light coatings, especially on the front lens. For astronomy, we want to collect lots of light from dim objects to give the brightest and most detailed view. If a lot of the light is being reflected away, that is impossible. Those coatings are often made that way to block everything but a narrow range of colours, because poor design has led to colour fringing. And also, don't be tempted to buy anything with extreme high power. Anything over 10 to 12 times is going to end up an unpleasant experience, and they'll end up as paperweights. Unfortunately, as with most specialised equipment, you can't always believe what you read. Manufacturers and retailers get the specifications wrong, change specs without changing the model number, and some post fake reviews online. I find it useful to look for a product with good recent reviews overall, then focus on whether the negative reviews are sensible. Keep in mind you're looking for a budget pair of binoculars and set your expectations accordingly, but don't gamble on a pair you know has a major issue. If you're lucky enough to be able to test the binoculars you want to buy in person, you'll want to know ahead of time how to use them. Basic use is easy once you know what to do. First, you want to set the distance between the barrels to match the distance between your pupils, and then you want to focus each barrel. You should choose something at an intermediate to long distance and keep that distance constant as you focus each barrel. Ideally, don't squint, as this will blur your vision. Rather, cover the front lenses in turn, making sure to avoid touching them, which will leave smudges. The standard mechanism on most binoculars has one wheel or barrel at the center that adjusts focus for both lenses. Looking at the one object you've chosen, you need to adjust that center wheel, first looking through the left eyepiece while covering the front lens on the right barrel. Once the left eyepiece is in focus, cover it and look at the same object through the right eyepiece. Now twist the right objective eyepiece diopter adjustment so that the same object is also in focus on the right. Now that both eyepieces are set to focus on the same thing, when you need to refocus on something at a different distance, only need to use the center wheel. A couple of things to keep in mind. Bracing your elbows or arms on something will steady the view. And a technique that gets easier with a bit of practice is to look at whatever you want to view with your naked eye and then bring the binoculars up between yourself and the object. It's very difficult to demonstrate basic use in this format, so I've provided a link to a video that demonstrates this well. Now that you know how to use them, what should you be looking for when you test binoculars? First of all, if possible, test the copy you'll be taking home. There can be quality issues and sample-to-sample variation with anything made cheaply. You want to make sure that the focus controls work and that they are free but not loose. Look for dust, chips, paint flecks, fluid and sticky residue, especially on the inside, which isn't easily cleaned. Good binoculars will be easy to focus and hold focus. They should be comfortable to use, and there should be no massive amount of play or flex. Check the collimation. Once adjusted, you should see a single image aligned in both eyepieces without having to strain to make them come together. Here are simulated views through binoculars to show the difference between what you'd see in a pair that is collimated versus one that isn't. Once you have the distance between the barrels correctly set and the object in focus, you shouldn't have to strain or work to avoid double images. Here are simulated views through binoculars to show the difference between what you'd see in a pair that is collimated versus one that isn't. Once you have the distance between the barrels correctly set and the object in focus, you shouldn't have to strain or work to avoid double images. You should also be looking to make sure the view is bright, clear and sharp through both eyes. Checking against objects with straight edges and signs with different sizes of text can be helpful. The edges might not be quite as sharp as the center, but there shouldn't be a very large reduction in quality. You should take note of colored halos. The less of those, the better. And the image shouldn't be heavily tinged or unnatural in color. If you intend to use them with glasses, make sure there's enough eye relief and that they're comfortable to use with the glasses on. Here are some simulated images showing color cast and fringing. You can see that the color on the left sign is warmer and more natural, whereas the color on the right sign has an unpleasant green tinge to it. That means some of the colors are being cut out. Compare the colors you see through the binoculars with what you see with your naked eyes. The purple fringe around the bird isn't great. You're going to see that fringing with high contrast, where you have a bright object near a darker one. That's why you're seeing it more on the left side of the bird, which is in shadow, right next to a bright blue sky. Some amount of color fringing is acceptable and expected, especially with cheaper binoculars, but it is going to affect astronomical viewing, so the less the better. I've already mentioned comfort, but this is a really important consideration. You're looking for a pair of binoculars that are a pleasure to use and will encourage you to take them out. So consider the weight, balance, and comfort holding them. If you think the strap is too short, you might want to factor in replacing it when you consider the price. If you wear glasses, try the binoculars with and without to see if either or both work. Make sure you can set the distance between the lenses to match your eyes. You should easily be able to merge the view from both eyepieces into one circle. If you can't, that pair is not for you. Look for the features we discussed earlier. Rarely you'll see binoculars with individual eyepiece focus instead of a central focuser. They will require you to refocus each eyepiece for each distance. You view objects at virtual infinity for astronomy, so won't change the focus distance often. Still, these are slower to use, and for non-astronomical use, they will quickly become frustrating. You should look for binoculars with a screw for a tripod adapter. They're often hidden under a small cap at the front of the hinge between the barrels. Adapters are cheap if you already have a camera tripod that can hold the weight. Unfortunately, lens caps at this price point tend to have a terrible set of tolerances and fit too loosely, meaning that they're always falling off. If they do fit well, this may be an indicator that there's been some attention paid to the quality. There are some things you won't be able to test for at the shop, and that's why reviews are important. Some of the things you can't test until you're under a dark sky include how bright they are for astronomy, how much detail you see in various objects, and how easily they fog up. Reviews can be manipulated, and manufacturers can change the product over time, but at least you can look for people reporting showstoppers. If lots of people are reporting that they're poor quality, that they aren't aligned, or that they have a particular issue, it may save you a bad purchase. One way to improve your chances of bringing home a quality pair of binoculars is to stick with well-reviewed models from well-known manufacturers and retailers. There are manufacturers that specialize in astronomical binoculars and telescopes. Camera manufacturers also make good binoculars, but not as many budget pairs. Once you have some experience, you can start to look into some of the lesser-known brands without it being as big a gamble. I have occasionally come across a real bargain, like one pair I bought at a homeware bargain store for $25 about 15 years ago, that is almost as good as some of my best. I'm not here to sell you any particular brand, but in the notes I've given links for some cheap binoculars available in 2023. As for where to buy, if you find a local store that has a reasonably priced pair of binoculars and they let you test them, consider supporting them. As everything moves online, they're a dying breed. Like shopping for other products, you'll need to keep an eye out for scammers, fake reviews, and incorrect specifications. Part 2. Using binoculars for astronomy. Once you've acquired a pair of binoculars, what should you do to get the most out of them? As with all astronomy, planning is key. I'm going to go through some specific suggestions of what to look at shortly, but first let's talk about some of the best resources available for picking targets. These aren't specific to binocular observing, so you might want to keep in mind that larger objects are going to be best for low magnification. First of all, there is our very own WASAG monthly newsletter, which includes excellent suggestions for what to observe. Objects are selected and charts drawn by hand by our members who have many years of experience observing and do a wonderful job guiding you to interesting objects. There are also other periodic sky guides like the Powerhouse Museum Sky Guides. These appear to have replaced Sydney Observatory's own sky guides, which used to be produced alongside an audio podcast. Many phone apps and some PC software also produce periodic observation guides as part of the package, and some are very well done. Sky guides can be found in book form too, for those that prefer that. The advantage of sky guides like this is that they present handy information about what you can observe now or soon. But other books that list objects by different criteria can also give you an idea of what to keep a lookout for when the objects do come into view. Make sure your guides are applicable to the local sky. There are a lot of Northern Hemisphere specific sky guides out there. An excellent tool for planning your observations is planetarium or charting software. I like to use Stellarium because there are free versions on PC and mobile. This makes it easy to use not only ahead of time, but also when out observing. It's not difficult to use, but it's worth getting familiar with the settings menus and shortcut keys to change date, time and location to match where you'll be observing. It's worth setting up your absolute scale and limiting magnitude to match the local conditions as well. I also like to set up the Oculars edition to give me a circle that matches the field of view of the binoculars or telescope I'm using. And if you find that you're at a dark site and seeing a lot more stars than come up in the software, you should be aware that there are add-on catalogues you can install to fill that gap. One bad habit I have, because I'm lazy, is I'll duck in and out of the house to look at Stellarium on my desktop. The better way is to use a laptop and a night mode filter of some kind. Keep in mind these simulations aren't perfect. They use deep sky images with more detail than you're likely to see, and cameras don't see the same way our eyes do. Sketches and hand-drawn charts can be more accurate or better for locating things, but they require skill to make. Again, the WASAG newsletter comes to mind. Okay, so let's talk about some specific objects to look at if you're getting started, and take a look at some simulated views. Within the solar system, there are plenty of targets for your binoculars. The moon is obvious, but shouldn't be overlooked. If there's a bright comet in your sky, you should definitely take the opportunity to see it while you can. And you can use various software to plan looking at artificial satellites, including the International Space Station and the Hubble Space Telescope. There are usually plugins for planetarium software that give you time-accurate simulated views of those, but you'll need to set your time and location correctly, and you'll need an internet connection to get the latest data. Due to their size, the planets tend to be harder and often are nicer with a telescope that allows higher magnification. But you should still take a look through your binoculars at least once, if you haven't done so already, for the experience. Think about using a mount if you have access to one, since the smaller detail requires a steady view at low magnification. Now, let's take a look at some simulated views of a few deep sky objects I've selected. Some of the Messier objects are quite colourful and pleasing to the eye through binoculars. M6, the butterfly cluster, and M7, Ptolemy's cluster, are standouts and definitely worth looking at. M42 is the Orion Nebula. You can fit the nebula and the stars of the belt of Orion in a wide view pair of 7x50 or 10x50 binoculars. M45, the Pleiades, is spectacular in a telescope, but you can step back and look at the cluster in context in a pair of binoculars. Using binoculars, you'll be able to fit the entire Southern Cross in one view, and you'll start to be able to make out the jewel box near the leftmost star on the cross, Mimosa. Theta Carinae, nicknamed the Southern Pleiades, is another great target. It has always reminded me of a dog's paw. You can get a lot of fun out of looking up objects you've heard about if they're wide enough for binoculars. For example, you might have read about the Eta Carinae Nebula and want to take a look with your own eyes. Even when they're not as spectacular as you were hoping, you've gained a little more familiarity and experience with that part of the night sky. Omega Centauri can be seen as a fuzzy ball in small binoculars. Seeing it in binoculars first will help you to really appreciate the view, resolving the stars using a large telescope. And the Magellanic clouds are breathtaking. None of these simulated views are going to do justice to the real thing. So going out and looking with binoculars is definitely one of the easiest and most worthwhile things you can do when you get the chance. I find galaxies really hold my fascination. All of us have grown up taking it for granted, but it's only 100 years since we've known that galaxies aren't just nebula inside the Milky Way. In general, galaxies are easier to view with a telescope, but that's better appreciated if you've tried with binoculars first. M31 is the Andromeda Galaxy, and one of the better ones to look at through binoculars. M87 is another Messier object accessible with binoculars. Centaurus A and NGC 55 are harder to see, but may also be worth a try under dark skies. In the Northern Hemisphere, M81, Bode's Galaxy, and M82, the Cigar Galaxy, are easier options. Don't expect to see too much detail. In small binoculars, these objects can be fuzzy and require you to use averted vision. And that brings me to one of my tips for enjoying your binoculars. We've all been desensitized to movie effects and long exposure photos. A lot of people bring those expectations to their observing and then feel let down. I think the key is to actually understand what it is you're seeing. It's then easy to be amazed at what you've managed to see with your own eyes. Some more tips. When you don't have anything in particular in mind to view, try sweeping the sky. You'll find things you don't know about catching your eye, and then you can go back and try to work out what it was that you saw. You can increase the number of objects you see throughout the year by planning a mix of early and late sessions. Keep your binoculars handy and use them often when the conditions allow. Share your observing with your family, friends, and roommates, if you can get them interested. Part 3. Maintaining binoculars. This slide covers care and cleaning tips that most amateur astronomers are already familiar with. Most of this would also be obvious to anyone who's owned eyeglasses or cameras. I'll quickly cover this anyway, in case it is useful to someone new here or online. You want to keep the optical surfaces clean and smudge-free. Keep your fingers off the glass. When you do need to clean the lenses, brush off any dirt to avoid scratches before using a microfiber cloth to give them a wipe. If you're using tissues in a pinch, don't use tissues that feel rough to the touch and might scratch the surface. And make sure the tissues are not infused with aloe. If a dry cleaning isn't enough because something is stuck to the surface, use non-alcoholic lens cleaner like that you'd be using on your eyeglasses to avoid smudging. Isopropyl alcohol can be a good optical cleaner, but there is also a risk that it will eat away coatings, plastic, and markings on the binoculars. I can tell you from personal experience that even trying it on a small patch first can lead to more damage than is acceptable. Unfortunately, the only way to know is to try. It's always a good idea to store your binoculars carefully to avoid damage. Storing them in a case when not in use is a good idea. Keeping them away from small particles like sand, glitter, or flour is also good. Bumps and knocks could cause parts to shift or dislodge and alignment problems. A neck or hand strap is a good way to avoid dropping them. Don't get them wet, and if you do, dry them immediately. Store them in a case with some desiccant pouches to keep moisture and fungus away. Many binoculars come with desiccant in the packaging, so don't throw it out and think about replacing it if you still have your binoculars after a few years. One common problem with binoculars, especially cheap ones, is that they can be out of alignment or not collimated. This can literally give you headaches and will make using them difficult or even impossible. If you buy a pair and they're not collimated, the best thing is to send them back if you can. Other than the manufacturers, there aren't a lot of services for aligning binoculars, and even if you find a place that will do it, if you have to pay for it on a cheap pair, it will cost more than the binoculars did. If you're stuck with a pair that isn't aligned, it might be worth having a go to fix them yourself before you throw them away and buy a new pair. I wouldn't recommend you try this with an expensive pair unless you're completely out of options. I must emphasize that if you try this, it should be as a last resort and you do so at your own risk. First of all, you'll want to confirm that the pair really isn't collimated. You'll need to find a target to test them on. Bright points of light like stars at night and straight lines like power lines or antenna in the day make good targets. Whatever your target, keep in mind that you should do it somewhere that's not going to upset a privacy-conscious neighbour. Once you've confirmed there's a problem with the alignment, you're going to want to look back at the object and check that you've improved things. Make small changes and confirm after each time. Once you've adjusted the distance between the barrels properly so that one circle is formed and focused the binoculars, the images above the line on this slide show you what a view through a well-aligned pair should look like. It should take little or no effort for the images from both eyes to match and merge into one. If you're seeing a double image after adjusting them, or like the bottom right image, there is an alignment issue. Some familiarity with a pair that is aligned helps to confidently determine that this is the case. Most binoculars come with collimation screws that are used at the factory to achieve a reasonable alignment, and that's what you'll be using to align the binoculars. You'll need a precision or jeweler's screwdriver. The pairs I've worked on all had flathead screws. You need to make very small adjustments and check the alignment. If you've made things worse, turn the screw back to where it was and go the other way. Usually you'll have two screws that adjust the alignment in perpendicular directions to each other. Before you start, you'll want to check what happens when you very gently try to twist the barrels to make the barrels align. If there's too much flex or they flop and don't stay in position, you'll have to fix that issue before adjusting the collimation screws, since any flex may have a bigger effect than those screws. If you can't fix that, it might not be worth spending the time. Unfortunately, the screws aren't usually out in the open. Getting to them typically means peeling back the rubber and dealing with sticky glue. This might be difficult to do without tearing or damaging the rubber. These slides show you where the collimation screws were on a pair of binoculars I had, but they may be located elsewhere on other binoculars. You might be able to feel a small hole under the rubber, but usually you'll have to start peeling it back and guessing. As I said, this isn't something I'd be comfortable doing on a very expensive pair. When you're done, you'll need to glue the rubber back on carefully, avoiding the optics and the screws themselves. You'll want to use the minimum amount of glue you can get away with, since you might want to get back in to adjust them again later, and you don't want to tear the rubber when you do so. Make sure you have suitable glue ready, something that works with rubber, plastic and metal, but nothing too permanent, so no epoxy. Sometimes the screws are sunken into the body and you need to adjust them by feel through a small hole. Look for the adjustment screws both at the front and back of the binoculars. I hope you never have to do this kind of surgery on your binoculars. As I said, it's a last resort. But if you do this and have any success, I'd be interested in hearing about your experience. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you for listening. I'd also like to thank WASAG for allowing me to present, my friends and family for their feedback and patience, and those whose images I used for some of the slides. I'll make the slides available online, and at the end there will be references and my binocular reviews from the talk in 2012. And of course, I'm open to feedback, so feel free to contact me.